Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on December 2nd, 2016, and you're listening to episode 11. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast. And make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. First up, we had a question from Nick Waller on Twitter. Nick asked us to talk a little bit about the Parliament e-petitions. He finds it interesting, he says, that several petitions only exist to support existing bills, like Petition E466, which pretty much only exists to support Bill C-16, which introduces gender equality and expression into the Human Rights Code of Canada.
Yeah, and if you actually go on the website and look at the petition, once you get past the preamble, the single line in there asking the government to take action is to pass Bill C-16.
So the paper petition system required people to put their names on a piece of paper and those to be handed in. A number of other Commonwealth countries have introduced e-petition systems where you can file signatures online. The US has a big one, as does the United Kingdom and other countries. So local Burnaby MP Kennedy Stewart has long petitioned this sort of way to engage people in democracy more, to have them express their views. So he put through a private member's bill in the last parliament that actually got through, which is rare for a private member's bill, to establish this e-petition system. And the way it works now is you get 5 people together, you get 5 friends or whatever, and write up your petition and find an MP who will sponsor it. It then goes online. You have 120 days to get 500 signatures, just with names and emails. And if you get those, it'll be certified and then presented in the House of Commons for a government response within 90 days. Unfortunately, so far, when I've looked at some of the responses and this has only been sort of in the last year that this has been running, all the responses have come from the Trudeau government, of course, but they've all been sort of milquetoast. They're just, yeah, that's nice. We'll look at that, or we're in the process of considering that. Or if it's a very French thing, thank you for your opinion. Like they're not going to commit to doing anything based on 600 signatures, 1,000 signatures, maybe even 7,500. And I helped one petition process go through that called for the federal government to repeal the blasphemy law of the criminal code. And we got 7,400 signatures on that, and we're still waiting a government response. But frankly, I'm a little pessimistic. Like, it's not going to force a bill, but it's not even going to force a formal debate, which is one thing the UK system actually does. If you get over a certain number of signatures, Parliament has to debate it.
Yeah, and to me this seems mostly just a way to have a little political grandstand and be able for an MP to say, oh, you know, my constituents support whatever they want, or to try and push something into the federal realm that basically gets ignored. We've seen it elsewhere. The whitehouse.gov petitions have famously done nothing, though the Death Star one was amusing.
Yeah, you make a good point there. There's sort of 2 ways these petitions come about. You can have the real grassroots, the way it's sort of envisioned, like, this issue isn't being talked about. The government should at least have to think about it. And it does force that. Then there's that sort of AstroTurf version where maybe a party insider says, we just want to prove there's a bit more public support for this. It's not a national referendum. It's not a national debate on it. It's just extra names on an e-petition. So it sort of relates to the whole, fun with flags controversy we talked about back in episode 2, I think it actually was, where we talked about the controversies with the city of Vancouver putting up the flag of the People's Republic of China to sort of welcome a Chinese delegation here, and the controversy that drew. It's sort of meaningless gestures that can kind of bite governments.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is there's limited amount of time in Parliament to actually do the work of governing and passing legislation, and if it's not on anyone's policy agenda, it's very unlikely that just because a petition was put forward, they're going to change their legislative agenda.
Yeah, there's petitions up there calling for property rights to be added to the charter. That's not going to happen. Even if they get 10,000 signatures, even if they get 1 million signatures, there's just not going to be an effort to open up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms at this point. Good on people for being passionate about something and getting involved. And I do think there is some value to it, but let's not, pretend it's something it's not. So the first big segment this week is the big BC story, I guess, which is pipelines are approved, pipelines are not approved. Justin Trudeau came to town in the last week and announced that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline from pretty much the oil sands of Alberta to Burnaby will be approved. That's the twinning of the pipeline, essentially, expanding the capacity.
Yes, Kinder Morgan was originally built in, I believe, the 1950s, and it's been operating since then. And this project is to twin the line, basically expand capacity along the existing route.
Yeah, so capacity will be tripled. That means oil products and diluted bitumen will have 890,000 barrels a day coming to Vancouver. And this then leads to an increase in oil tanker traffic going in and out of the harbor here from 5 tankers per month to 34. So roughly a 7-fold increase in tankers, which is what a lot of people are really worried about in the city of Vancouver, because more tankers means more noise underwater, which means more threats to the undersea wildlife, like orcas and other animals.
Yeah, though I do find it interesting that you don't see that sort of same opposition to just expanding port activity, which has been an ongoing process for years now. There's continual investment in it. So it is a little interesting how tankers get the brunt of that when, say, expanding the container terminal doesn't.
I think there is some of people with a bit more of that consistency who do also talk about cargo capacity increase and worry about that. And Port Metrovan, I know, is in the midst of a PR campaign right now to talk themselves up. I think the reason oil tankers draw extra criticism is just the sort of chance of an oil spill, which is very tangible environmental harm, and the overall fossil fuel usage increase and sort of the climate change issue that this gets tied up in. More oil flowing to ships to go to China and Asia means more oil being refined there and then burned there, because most of it will get burned. And one thing I know in Alberta they're looking at is how to refine more domestically, but those aren't coming online right away, and maybe they never will. And the argument is, if we're pipelining it all out to China, why would we build a refinery here?
Yeah, and that is the thing, is the economics of refining in Canada aren't particularly good. With the existing refining capacity elsewhere, for the most part, there isn't much of a business case to be doing refining here. And I think it's telling that during the oil boom, despite, huge amounts of money going into oil, nobody was putting forward a business case for building a refinery in Canada. So I think that's unlikely to proceed, regardless of any pipeline or not that gets approved.
There were a couple other aspects to this announcement. The first being that the Northern Gateway line, the pipeline that would have gone to Kitmat in the North Coast and involved a big refinery and dock in those fjords, that one has been killed, which I know a lot of people were very opposed to, because they'd have to cut it through. Essentially, they'd have to build a new pipeline. I mean, all of them are new pipelines, but that one is a new route across territories that they'd have to negotiate with First Nations groups. And it presents a lot more of a headache. I can see why they didn't go that route.
Yeah, and there's also increased concern about spills and response there. The area is not nearly as well charted as the southern waterways in BC. It's further away from anywhere, so response time is increased. Additionally, there's lots of narrow channels, lots of islands there. Definitely presents a navigational problem. And then combined with the winter storms you get up there, there's a greater chance of a spill and less ability to respond to it up there, which presented additional concerns people had, and I can see why that one got a lot more controversial.
Well, and on the spill question, one of the things the government did to try to allay those fears was re-emphasize their shoreline protection plan, sort of $1.5 billion to go to a 3-coast protection, additional Coast Guard capacity, additional oil response to try to allay that. So I know this was a big issue for a lot of people living on the coast, and it'll help deal with even what seem like fringe issues like derelict vessels. But there was a debate in the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago about washed up old boats and sort of abandoned boats floating around and causing dangers. And this is a serious issue that hasn't really been addressed by any government. So I don't think anyone's opposed to that part of the plan for sure.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with that, and that the government did roll it out recently. We talked about it when it was announced. It's one of the conditions Premier Christy Clark put on any oil project coming out here. And as we discussed then, it was clearly telegraphing this announcement. And they've spent the last couple months laying the groundwork between the carbon pricing, between spill response investments, clearly trying to shore up their bona fides on the whole environmental side, so they had some political cover to announce a pipeline approval.
But people were still seemingly surprised, at least on my social media, and at least people who lived in BC.
I saw the same thing too, and that really confused me because not only have they recently spent time talking about approving it, but even during the campaign a year ago, they were discussing how, yes, there's environmental concerns, but they also need to be balanced with getting resources to market. And I think anybody who's paid attention since Trudeau became Liberal leader should not be surprised by this at all.
I think it's sort of the disconnect between wanting to view him as his social media presence, which is, very thin, not very deep, but cares about environment, cares about, the middle class. But then people don't realize that, he's had this long position. Everyone has always talked about how he prefers Kinder Morgan over Northern Gateway. Like, it wasn't a surprise to me, but I saw people literally felt betrayed by this, and what we'll get into next.
Yeah, it definitely drew a fair bit of opposition here. I know there were protests about it here, and a lot of people were really annoyed, up in arms about it. There was protests last year on Burnaby Mountain when they were doing some of the initial exploratory work and geological surveying for it. There were protests after this was announced. It's definitely been a contentious issue here.
Yeah, people are talking about ramping up protests to the level of the Clayoquot Sound protests. I don't remember those vividly, but that's the level of, people are going to be out there till they get arrested, and that's the feeling I think a lot of people have and the commitment to it. I think even like some politicians...
Elizabeth May said she'd be willing to go to jail to try and block this.
Well, what I found really interesting on the political line, you obviously had the NDP MPs from BC who've been talking about their opposition to this for months and months and months. They obviously are still opposed to it and are speaking out as much. You have, the mayor of Vancouver, the mayor of Burnaby speaking out in opposition to it, as well as a lot of First Nations bands. But I'm seeing a lot of local Liberal MPs feeling the room and walking back from their party. Most noticeably, our own MP here, Joyce Murray, put out a strong statement by email to all of her people on her email list, at least, saying she's incredibly disappointed in it. Like, she just broke ranks with her party and said, I know people in Vancouver are going to be pissed, and I'm kind of pissed too.
Well, that is the thing. This has put the local Liberal MPs in a very tough position. Liberals did very well in the Vancouver area in this last election, and there, as we were discussing, there's a lot of local opposition here, and nobody's really that invested here the way they are in Alberta about getting this pipeline built. You probably have some weak support and a lot of strong opposition, and it's going to be hard for them to go forward with the Liberal brand when it now has that pipeline association in an area that's very strongly opposed to it.
Yeah, in Alberta, the Liberals only have 4 seats, but they've essentially sided with Alberta here. Like, they attribute this plan going forward and this pipeline's going forward to Rachel Notley's climate change plan. They say that will help us bring down the emissions enough that we can, put this oil to market and support jobs there and yada, yada, yada. But now there's a lot of talk about, will this cost the Liberal Party of Canada seats in BC? And the Dogwood Institute, which is an environmental group that's done a lot of polling on this issue, commissioned Insights West to ask some questions, and they found 2/3 of people who voted Liberal in the last election want to see fewer oil tankers off the coast of BC. And they sort of frame the whole poll in that way. So I don't find the questions as helpful as, do you support this pipeline or not? But I guess people can support a pipeline but not want more oil tankers, but not realize one thing leads to the other.
Yes, and looking over the questions they asked in the poll, there's definitely a slant there. They polled on the downsides. They didn't ask about any potential benefits, asked questions about oil tankers, traffic, asked questions about whales. Didn't ask, for example, do you support this as a way to export Canadian products to market? Which would be a counterpoint to it, provide a little more of a nuanced view of it. Because if you're only asked about the bad parts of it, you're probably going to get a response that indicates more opposition than might actually exist in a more nuanced view.
So to Insights West credit, they have done their own polling on this. They do, like all pollsters, a lot of just sort of public interest polls to get their name out there. And for at least a couple of years, they polled on the Northern Gateway and Kinder Morgan pipelines. In July 2015, they found 41% supported the Northern Gateway and 42% supported the Kinder Morgan, with roughly 50 and 45% opposed respectively. But in March 2016, this year, only 35% of people supported Northern Gateway and only 36% of people supported Kinder Morgan. Essentially, support for both pipelines dropped 5 to 6%, statistically significant in a matter of just under a year. So there's this sort of shift they managed to measure and capture that neither of these pipelines is popular in BC, and there is a sort of opposition to it that is a majority. And that's what I think is going to be really hard for the government to go into the next election on, because Christy Clark and the BC Liberals have not taken a strong supportive stance of either pipeline. They sort of set out their famous 5 conditions, as we mentioned, and she hasn't said so far if this has met them. She's sort of signaling maybe it has. And I think if she can build the case for that, she'll run on that in the campaign, as it's a good pipeline for BC. Well, the BC NDP is the job-killing anti-pipeline group, as always.
Yeah, and it helps that she staked out a fairly clear position early on and can take a wait-and-see approach and refer back to that position going forward. And as the politics shake out on this and we get to see where the reaction is, I expect that Clark's going to make a more definitive statement on this.
Oh, yeah. I would be surprised if she waited more than another week or two to take a position, and I'd be surprised if she actually did oppose the pipeline in the end. It might be that she finds a way, it magically does give money to BC by just sort of going right through us.
On the opposition side here in BC, the NDP have come out strongly against, which is a contrast to their 2013 position of against but for but against.
Depending on which week of the campaign it was.
And I think it's going to be interesting to watch and see whether or not they can keep that firm position. Because as previously discussed, there is some tension within the NDP ranks on how to split the environmental concerns versus the job concerns among their base. And they're taking a clear stance here, but when the campaign really gets in full swing and jobs become a major issue, are they going to be able to hold that position under pressure?
It might be that they're hoping to fight the campaign on education, but there are very few election campaigns that get fought on issues like education. It's going to come back at some level to the economy and to jobs, as it always does. And I think the NDP does have an opportunity to stake out a sort of, we're going to build green energy jobs and really present a strong plan on that front. But you can't just start from we're rejecting everything, or else that's what they're going to be criticized for, because they've been criticized for it in the past and it's worked.
Yes, and BC is also, I think, a tougher place to build that green energy jobs narrative, because we don't have a lot of dirty energy right now to replace it with. There aren't coal plants that we can employ a bunch of people tearing down and putting up wind turbines in their place. We have 2 thermal plants that make up a tiny fraction of our overall power generation capability. And that's not really the point where any significant changed and be implemented on by phasing those out. And without that, and there's no easy green export we can transition in. So I don't see an easy way forward for the NDP to make a solid Greens jobs case in British Columbia. It'd be a lot easier in, say, Ontario, where they had a lot of coal plants and did invest a lot of money in developing replacement capacity.
It might just be that they're looking at running that same we're out in front kind of campaign that the NDP and sort of left-leaning parties, even like the Democratic Party in the US, have done so many times recently to such horrible results. Right now, 308 just put up his latest poll aggregation, which put the NDP at 39% and the Liberals at 37%. Interestingly, the BC Conservatives have dropped to 8%, which is still high considering they don't really have a leader. But I guess it's sort of a parked vote. The Greens are at 15%, which is still doing well for them. And depending how Andrew Weaver does the next couple months, he may hold that. He may even grow it, I think.
Yeah, I do think Andrew Weaver has a lot of potential to grow the Greens in this coming election, because you have kind of two unpopular parties, and he might be able to siphon off people who are disaffected by both.
And he definitely has the clearest position and easiest position on pipelines. He can just say, I reject them all because they promote oil consumption, which promotes global warming and is therefore anti why the Green Party exists.
Yeah, and I think that's a case he could probably fairly easily make. I'm not necessarily convinced that, from a pure policy perspective, that's the right approach to take on climate, but I think for the Green Party, it's probably a winning way to push forward. And at least on the climate front, I don't have a huge problem with the pipelines. I'd much rather see the externalities get addressed, full-on carbon pricing, and that was one of the things that was brought up as to why they were able to move forward on this, is because they were offsetting elsewhere. Today, Trevor Tombay, the economist, put forward a piece in Maclean's discussing this, basically putting forward the case that on a dollar-by-dollar basis to reduce emissions, tackling pipelines and focusing on blocking them is not the best way forward, and it would be much better to price in the externalities and watch the market adjust, because you're going to block any one project and you'll just get offsets elsewhere. And that's the thing. Without the ability to take a broad view approach and also go after the substitutions, you're not really going to get the changes that you really need to bring in there, especially in a cost-effective manner.
Yeah, I guess the worry is just that building these pipelines sort of lets the oil go out of Canada.
On the export side, it does get a little trickier, and I haven't seen a huge amount of detailed policy proposals one way or the other on how to address that. The other big news out of Ottawa is the Electoral Reform Committee released their report, and in the ensuing kerfuffle, the challenges they face basically being described as a tire fire on their handling of it. So for a little background, the committee is a multi-party committee. Every party has at least one representative on there. No one party holds a majority of the votes. It's different from a lot of other committees in that it actually represents vote totals, not seats in the House. And this week they released their report. Basic conclusion was they recommend using a proportional system. They didn't specify which one, and that it gets put to Canadians in a referendum. They also declined to endorse mandatory voting or online voting. And in addition to that, several of the parties released supplementary opinions to the report. The Liberals, oddly, for a party that's championed this and pushed for it.
And holds the most seats on the committee.
Holds the most seats, and this whole thing was them enacting their election promise on it, has described the report as radical and rushed, and is arguing against the referendum and for more consultations to take place.
Well, and then building onto that, the minister in the House of Commons mocked the report and sort of yelled at them essentially for not proposing a specific system, which was not in their mandate.
Yes.
She then apologized for that the next day, but that's why we call it a tire fire.
Yeah, the Liberals have horribly mishandled the last couple months of this file. I mean, they took some heat early on for taking a long time to get this committee start the process. And then in the last couple months, we've had the Liberals walking back their enthusiasm for it, suggesting that, maybe there isn't a consensus here. Maybe Canadians aren't engaged enough to go forward on this. And now when the report was put forward and the answer clearly wasn't what the PMO was looking for out of it, they've decided to push back hard on it. And as Mr. Monsef berated the committee for, didn't get the result they wanted. She berated them for both not having a specific policy proposal and also, oddly enough, criticized one of the components in the report, which was the use of the Gallagher Index to rank systems going forward for the next phase of the reform.
So the committee essentially said in their first recommendation, which was sort of an odd place to put the wonkiest bit, that the proportional system that Canada comes up with, whatever it should put this index, this number that you can calculate, which is essentially the difference between the vote share and number of seats a party gets, and try to bring that below 5%. So just really try to make it a fair system where if 40% of people vote Liberal, 40% of the MPs are Liberal MPs. And yet she stood up in Parliament and sort of mocked them for using this formula, which involves some squares and square roots. Not a hard formula, but sort of like a grade 10 formula, let's say.
I wouldn't even go that far. Square roots are something you encounter in middle school at the latest. This is not complex math here. It's basically Pythagorean theorem with a few tweaks applied to something other than a triangle.
And even if it was hard math, I don't want a government that complains that our committees are using math. I don't want a government that complains that they're using evidence or reason. This is the sort of anti-intellectual thing and the anti-elite thing that we've all criticized Trump for using, that we've all criticized these populist movements for using. I want a committee that spent 5 months getting wonky to have their decisions and, their policy based on the best whatever it is. Like, you don't come out after the Paris Agreement and go, they recommended we keep the climate to under 2%, but that was based on a pretty complicated formula, right? Why would we do that?
This is a government that handles $300 billion worth of expenses every year and handles a complex tax code and all of these other horribly complex things, and yet a square root presents too much of a problem for both the minister and Canadians in general. This is not that hard, and it should not be the sort of thing that throws a monkey wrench in the works.
Well, and it's a government that ran on a platform that emphasized evidence-based policy, that really argued for raising the level of debate and speaking and listening to experts. And then as soon as a group of MPs spend 5 months listening to experts, come up with some clear proposals to just turn around and mock them for it, was disgraceful.
Yes, and the evidence-based policy thing was always oversold. Evidence can only get you so far. Eventually you come back to a question of values. Evidence can tell you that seatbelts save lives, but it can't tell you whether or not that's worth the trade-off to personal liberty, for example. And there's always going to be a values question, so the evidence-based thing was never as clear-cut as they made it out to be. And on this and a few other files, they've clearly shown a desire to go with what's politically convenient, what they want to do anyway. And as we mentioned last week, they decided to buy some new fighters. Well, it turns out they've actually just removed a previous report that suggested against buying an interim fighter from the Department of National Defense's website. So they're clearly not above just ignoring the evidence when it doesn't meet their political needs.
So that's all bad enough on this file. But then even within the main report and the Liberal supplemental report, there was then an NDP and Green, or Elizabeth May, I guess, second supplementary report that really urged the government to do something, keep its promise. And it said, those two parties would prefer mixed member proportional or the sort of rural-urban proportional system that's been proposed and talked about a little bit.
Well, the urban-rural proportional is quite an interesting thing. I think it actually shows a lot of the value of this committee because it wasn't a previously considered proposal at all. Even among electoral reform wants, it wasn't something that had garnered much attention.
I think we missed it in our own deep dive into electoral reform.
Yes, it was a note at the end of in which we'd cut for time. We didn't think it was going to really gain traction. Turns out we were wrong on that one. But
we all get things wrong.
Yeah. But I think it does show the value of these committees and how they can bring forward ideas that aren't necessarily in the public consciousness, or even the consciousness of a lot of experts.
Yeah, we haven't done a lot of, national discussion and national research on electoral reform in Canada. There's been, sort of Fair Vote Canada and a few other groups have looked at it. And then there have been studies at the provincial levels in a few provinces. I think there was a Law Commission report, 15, 20 years ago about this. But this is a 300-page document that I haven't fully read yet because it's a 300-page document. But it looks at the history of electoral reform in Canada. It looks at all these little different issues. And it even goes into some of those other things like online voting and mandatory voting and why those won't work. And I imagine the arguments are basically what we talked about in our electoral reform discussion. And it also talks about how we can improve accessibility. And no one disagrees with that, and those things at least are going forward. If nothing else, hopefully it'll get a little easier for everyone to vote. So this won't be a total wash, but it does look a lot like the Liberals have done literally everything they can do to sabotage their own promise.
Yes, that definitely appears to be the case. And from the early comments the Liberals were making, they appear to be favoring the alternative vote or instant runoff, however you want to label it.
Ranked ballots.
Yeah, a single member ranked ballot where one person would get elected, and it was a system that definitely drives voters and everyone to the center. And great for the Liberal Party, not so great for anyone else. And when it was clear there was no desire among the committee to go forward with that, except maybe the minority of Liberal members, the government started to take a less interested approach to it and try to back away from it.
That's when I think you start to see the sort of, plurality of the committee, which is the Liberal members, talk about it being so radical and how, despite getting 22,000 responses, well, all of those responses were people who vote regularly anyway, and they're not perfectly representative because you're never going to get a representative sample. And then they can go, well, there's no national consensus on this.
And that was definitely a concern going forward during the consultation phases, that you're always going to get a somewhat biased sample, and that the people who bothered to turn out to these events cared about the issue. And it was one of the arguments for going for a referendum, is you get a wider swath of people potentially engaged in it.
But then you had the Liberals turn around and say holding a referendum would be divisive and maybe no one would turn up anyway.
Yeah, well, the Liberals have clearly mishandled the communication. Mr. Monsef at one point even suggested Twitter would be a better way to engage Canadians on it. And hey, that's pretty blatantly absurd.
I would almost call for her to be sacked from her position, except that I think that would be an excuse for them to further delay the entire process.
Yeah.
Because then a new minister would have to start from ground zero.
But at the same time, she has badly mishandled this whole file, and that's probably been the most disappointing of the Trudeau cabinet pits. Her name never comes up with good publicity. It's always when something's going wrong, some issue arises, and it was definitely a mistake, I think, on Trudeau's part to put a rookie MP in charge of such an important file.
Yeah, most years, democratic reform is sort of tweaking around the edges. It's a file that you should be a wonk about it, and you should be a nerd and have some experience, I imagine. But, someone dedicated who is, a novice could probably take it on. But when your sort of key pledge is last election under first past the post, you need power. And I think he was hopeful. And there's nothing wrong with, putting your trust in someone who's new. There have definitely been new cabinet members who've stood out. Alberta's government, which went from having 2 MLAs to having to form a government caucus, shows you can get star candidates. You can get star cabinet members who have no political experience.
They're usually, though, significantly more well-regarded outside of politics, too. And I don't think that was the case here as much. And what's really confusing to me is it's not like they don't have people with a strong background on this file in cabinet. Stéphane Dion is the one that obviously comes to mind. He's put forward different policy proposals before. The guy's an academic. Like, he knows his stuff, and without a doubt would have handled this file much better.
Even Joyce Murray, who ran for the leadership against Trudeau, put forward some democratic reform ideas. They were a bit more sympathetic to working with the NDP and things like that, but she talked about it, and she's a long-term MP. Like, it might not be her bread and butter, but I don't think she got a serious cabinet role out of it.
She didn't get any cabinet role out of it. And there's a lot of talent on the Liberal bench, which is why it's confusing. I mean, I can kind of understand the Dion thing, because in his previous positions and papers on the subject, he has endorsed a referendum, which is clearly not what Trudeau wants. I can kind of see why that would create a little awkwardness, but it's not like Dion was the only person with the depth of policy experience, or even just an experienced politician who could work with this stuff and, not do stupid foot-and-mouth stuff, such as attacking the committee for doing its job by saying they didn't do their job. And
at this point, it's really hard to argue it hasn't been a coordinated plan every step of the way by the Liberals to sabotage themselves on this, to make sure it doesn't happen, except that they haven't gone to a referendum. Like, if they really wanted to kill it, they could just go to a referendum and then just run a bad campaign, and they'd take a little bit of heat for it, but what would they care?
Yeah, the only thing that strikes me as why this isn't clearly self-sabotage is just how bad a job they've done at it. And I don't mean badly running to try and get to the end result. I mean, they've done a bad job at sabotaging their own process. There are so many better ways to do this. One of them is go for a referendum and then basically no government support at all, nothing for this. Kind of what you've seen in a couple provinces where it gets put out there, but nobody, no resources get dedicated to actually passing the thing. That's one way going forward. The other thing they could have done after this report is just, do what Ottawa does best, which is be slow and inefficient at delivering what they want to and what they've promised.
There are a lot of committee reports sitting on a lot of shelves collecting dust.
Exactly. And, instead of saying, what's up with this math equation, they could have gone with, oh, this is a big report. Let's study it for a while. And then, maybe every couple months, make some noise about going a little on with it, and basically slow roll the thing into 2019. And at which point, you have another election, a whole bunch of new priorities come about in that platform. Yeah, sure, you make a line in the platform about implementing the report, but, you clearly downplay it, put it near the end, low priority, and then, it's just, our new government has these agendas that we really pushed for in the new election, and these are going to be our priorities, and then the whole thing just gathers dust. Like, there's an easy way to kill this, and it's surprising if they actually wanted to sabotage or they haven't done something similar. It's just this weird, uncanny valley where it kind of appears they want to sabotage it, but they're doing it in such a half-hearted way. It kind of appears they want to go about it, but they're also doing it in such a half-hearted way.
They're trying to keep the honeymoon going, while also realizing at some point they're going to have to bite the bullet and start taking hits. I mean, that's what happens with the Kinder Morgan approval. That's what's starting to happen on here. And I guess that sort of spins us in to the next thing we put down for just a quick mention, is that Trudeau took all kinds of flack this last week for giving his sort of rosy memorial to Fidel Castro, who passed away, who died a week ago.
The statement Prime Minister Trudeau released said, among other things, that while a controversial figure, both Castro supporters and detractors recognize his tremendous dedication and love for the Cuban people. who had a deep and lasting affection for El Comandante. And this drew a lot of criticism, both domestically and abroad. There was an amusing hashtag trending on Twitter of Trudeau eulogies, where basically whitewashing the downsides and emphasizing the great stuff, such as Pol Pot showed a tremendous dedication to addressing the problems of overpopulation, or Adolf Hitler's emphasis on building German transportation infrastructure. And there was a lot of criticism here that there are some pretty negative aspects of the Castro regime, to put things mildly. People were killed, political dissidents were jailed or tortured, and homosexuals were imprisoned. Just a long list of human rights abuses.
And a lot of the claimed benefits are arguably overstated in some cases by people who just want to see a more socialist country.
That is the thing. Like, it would be one thing if, Cuba was the shining example in the region and, the star of the Caribbean, but at best it kind of, meets kind of the regional average. And, I still don't think the costs would be worth it, but you could, if there was, if it was clearly, the best Caribbean country in all these metrics, it would be one thing, but the outcomes, sure, Castro's improved the healthcare system and education, but, we've done the same thing since 1959, and we didn't need a dictatorship to do it. That we didn't even have universal healthcare when Castro took over. We managed to implement that without also becoming a dictatorship or killing and imprisoning people. And that, I think, rightly drew a fair bit of criticism when Trudeau lauded the accomplishments that other countries have also made, while downplaying all the negative and costly aspects of the Castro regime and the human rights abuses.
I think this is a justified angle. It's a gloss over. On the other hand, though, I can't help but feel that it's, one statement he put out on his website, and it's the sort of Prime Minister needs to put out a statement that X controversial world leader has died. And it's been pointed out that Harper released not the exact same statements, but very, glossy kind of statements about when I believe it was the King of Saudi Arabia died a few years ago. Also a dictatorship where tons of human rights abuses. And he just sort of talked about how, it's too bad this nice man died. We're on good relations with both these countries. As allies, we can't just come out and criticize them and say, that was a terrible person who just died and good riddance. I guess Trudeau did talk about how his dad was friends with Fidel.
I think that actually is part of the reason why this story gained a lot of legs, and Stephen Harper's statement on the King of Saudi Arabia didn't, is this plays into an existing narrative that the Trudeau family has a personal connection to the Castros. And in addition to that, he said some stuff, such as admiring the Chinese government and a few other things like that kind of builds on a narrative of Trudeau maybe isn't as strongly opposed to these sorts of dictatorial regimes as one ought to be. And while there's definitely a diplomatic reality angle to the whole thing, I don't think anyone ever thought Harper actually liked the Saudis, and there's some lingering questions as to whether Trudeau likes the Castro regime, and it was able to build on that existing narrative, and that's why this became the story, and Abdullah's death didn't.
Yeah, I think this narrative is definitely prevalent in the right, and the conservative supporters are always looking for the thing to latch on to that Trudeau does. And this is a perfect thing for them to, because it's literally conservatives going, look, we have a communist in charge. He's affiliating with communists, commies. So I'm still skeptical, though, if this, rather than the two stories we just talked about, has any effect on his sort of honeymoon period, which is way overextended for some reason. I think, in BC, the Kinder Morgan pipeline is going to do a lot more damage to his brand, as it were, than anything else. And the electoral reform mishandling is going to do a lot of harm to him. I think maybe in the middle, some people are going to be a little upset, but in 2 weeks, is anyone going to care?
Yeah, I think you might be able to pick off a few of the blue grits on this and maybe chip at the edges a bit from the right on the Castro statement. But in terms of actually ending the honeymoon, I think the disillusionment on the left from the previous two stories we talked about is going to be much greater. And that's going to be where he's most vulnerable, is going into 2019. Is he going to be able to make the case to the soft orange voter that he is in fact the best person to carry the fight forward on? And between pipelines and walking back electoral reform, it's going to be a much more difficult challenge than last time.
Moving on, earlier this week, bringing it back to BC, the BC Liberal government announced not only are they having a budget surplus this year, but it's bigger than they predicted. They budgeted for a surplus of $264 million on government levels. Is the kind of, we're crossing our fingers that it's going to go well.
It's effectively a balanced budget. With the margin of error with projections a year out, it's a balanced budget, essentially.
And in the end, it turned out that our budget surplus is going to be $2.24 billion. So effectively a factor of 10 larger. This is very familiar for me. I grew up under Ralph Klein's era, where he would make a prediction of, a $1 billion surplus, and then there'd be $10 billion. And that just happened to be an election year. And people got a bit cynical. Of course, it's always nicer to have that going for your government than the exact opposite, where, the market crashes, like in 2008, where Harper was predicting everything would still be fine in the fiscal update when it clearly wasn't going to be.
Yeah, there's definitely a political calculus of pushing for a surplus in election year. We saw that federally in this last election, is that the 2015 budget really slashed a lot of stuff that probably didn't need to be slashed to try and hit that balanced budget. They were on track to balance it in 2015. Market kind of took a bit of a nosedive when oil fell. It was going to be a deficit, and they really hit hard to try and meet that 2015 deadline. They could have wound down the deficit spending just slightly slower, hit 2016, probably would have been a little smoother, probably would have saved them some political headaches in the process, but they really wanted to hit that election year deadline. And I think you're seeing maybe a little bit here, but at the same time, as I was alluding to, there's a lot of uncertainty with these, and the people at the Ministry of Finance do their best, and there's a lot of good modeling on it, but there's going to be a built-in contingency plan. Any province that has really any stake in natural resources and commodities, they fluctuate a lot, and that's a big factor of uncertainty. And just this past year has been fairly economically uncertain, so it's not that surprising that they kind of missed the mark. Now, an order of magnitude is significant, but it doesn't necessarily indicate to me that this is a Kleinian fudge of the numbers.
Yeah, no one ever is really that upset at a government that lowballs their budget. Like, it's a bit annoying, but I think people are much happier to go, oh, well, we have more money, so that's a good thing, right? And that's especially a good thing this year when we know the government is facing potential costs of hundreds of millions of dollars per year in education to make up for the self-inflicted wounds they did by slashing teacher contracts. And it's why I think we're seeing sort of positive news stories around the BCTF government discussions right now. I saw just a story today that the union and government had been meeting, and they described their talks as positive. It doesn't tell us what's going to result, but I think the government has signaled a lot that they're going to use this, Supreme Court of Canada ruling as an opportunity to invest in education, which is, I think, just all lining up for the election. They can talk about their fiscal record based on this surplus, and they can start to show how they're going to reinvest in public education and try to really undercut a lot of the criticisms the NDP are going to have to try to make.
They're definitely, I think, going to try and kill the BC teachers story as best they can. It wouldn't surprise me to see late winter something come out where some kind of deal struck or a major policy announcement comes forward on the education front to try and direct attention away from the Supreme Court loss. Now, it's probably also going to be sometime around the time the written opinion comes out, so that may resurface the whole thing, and that could be a potential problem for them. But with this new budget number coming out, I think they are going into it with a stronger position. We talked when the court decision first came down about whether or not this would present some challenges on the fiscal side because of the new costs that will be associated with it, but this one here has more than enough breathing room for them to make some education outlays and still come out with a balanced budget. One final political story, this time from a little further afield, is the Ontario Auditor General just released their report and had some rather scathing criticisms of the Ontario Liberal Party, who have been running the province since 2003, currently on their second Liberal Premier in that time, Kathleen Wynne, and, well, there's a lot to dig into there. The stuff that really stuck out for me was on the infrastructure side. The Auditor General revealed that contractors have been getting paid full contract price for some really shoddy work, including times where they've messed around with asphalt tests and done substandard paving work, or the thing that really stuck out to me was one contractor actually installed a bridge truss upside down, and which, how do you screw up that badly? It's shocking that that even happened, but then beyond that, they actually just got paid full price for the work, which is really, I think, concerning. And there's a couple other ones from Metrolinx, which is the Greater Toronto Area's version of TransLink, basically the regional transportation and transit authority, paid full price for similar work. And if anyone's been following the Toronto transit issues, they've been chronically underfunded, massive need of expansion, and yet we find out now they're basically throwing money at substandard work. The Liberal Party's definitely getting long in the tooth, and I think that mentality where a government's just been in power too long, it's gotten too comfortable, starting to set in, and they're not really, if they ever did, they've definitely done so less now of watching the public purse and being good stewards of the public's money.
Yeah, the criticism for the Ontario Liberals specifically for a number of years now has been exactly this, but not as sharp or as sort of authoritative. It's sort of the partisan, well, they're liberals, therefore they're corrupt, and bad at, spending money. They're just going to piss it away. And then this is that sort of independent confirmation that, oh, fuck, they really did fuck everything up. I know the trickle of Ontario politics stories I pick up on, that's been a consistent theme for a number of years, just over little power projects and different things they've worked on. I think the thing that's only really worked in their favor is they're facing just such incompetent oppositions. The Ontario Progressive Conservatives are just this like mishmash that sometimes tries to be the moderate progressive conservative that we saw in like Alberta, but then their newest MPP, the 19-year-old who just got elected, is a nut. He avoided a recent debate over expanding, I think it was the family adoption papers to be more gender neutral and just to make it more fair for same-sex and so forth couples. He didn't show up for that vote, but as far as I could tell, his comments were, it better say mother and father in there or God's going to come down on this. And that's kind of the face of their party to some extent.
It's definitely been an ever-present struggle with the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. Election after election should have been winnable for them, and something always kind of throws a wrench in the works, and it's often some eruption from some wing of the party. There's also the recently expanded and revised SETS Ed program in Ontario schools, got a lot of social conservatives really up in arms, and their newish leader, Patrick Brown, former federal conservative backbencher, now party leader, clearly sees that this is not a winning strategy for him, and he's trying the Harper approach of keeping the social conservatives on the down low because that's what loses the conservatives' elections, is whenever that arises, but hasn't been that successful. And Ontario, I think, actually really shows the importance of having a strong opposition and especially an opposition that is capable of forming government and present a compelling case for it, even if it's not a party that one would necessarily support. I think it's good to have those strong opposition parties, because after about a decade, most governments get way too comfortable, and if they aren't having to fend off serious attacks, that comfort only grows, and they get a little too corrupt, a little too loose with the rules and the due diligence on the public's tax money. And it's why I sincerely hope that as the federal Conservatives and the federal NDP go forward, they both pick serious leaders who can present a compelling government-in-waiting case, and as a serious opposition, even if I don't necessarily agree with the parties on that, I think there's an importance to just the democrat process of having a strong and competent opposition, even if I disagree with them on policy.
Absolutely. And
that has been Politicos. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. If you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.